Good day and welcome to this very special broadcast of the funeral service of the late revolutionary leader Fidel Castro. El Comandante, I'm Yevgen Jensen.
And I'm Rotenda Maiwanshe. For the next few hours, we will be bringing you live proceedings of the state funeral of the late Cuban leader. Even it is such a very important day, laying to raise one of the most important figures of the 20th century, isn't it?
I think especially for the African continent, I think people don't realize how important his role was on the African continent, how he was maybe the last nail in the coffin for colonialism on the continent, and then for us specifically in South Africa, I think the independence of Namibia and eventually the fall of apartheid came in the wake of that. So I think it's a landmark day today.
Definitely, and we'll get more from my guest later on.
Absolutely. Now, when Fidel Castro died just over a week ago, many African leaders praised him for his revolutionary ideas and commitment to African independence movements. Now, our reporter Aldrin Samper looks at South Africa's relationship with Cuba and its late leader, Fidel Castro.
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. Yasser Arafat, Colonel Gaddafi, Fidel Castro support our struggle to the hilt. There is no reason whatsoever why we should have any hesitation about hailing their commitment to human rights as they are being demanded in South Africa. Our attitude is based solely on the fact that they fully support the anti-apartheid struggle. They do not support it only in rhetoric. They are placing resources at our disposal for us to win the struggle.
Well, my president, my brother.
President, my brother.
How are you?
My brother.
Please. Very nice to see you.
Estoy tan contento de verlo.
Please sit down.
Tan contento. Por favor, tenga bien sentarse.
Please sit down.
Siéntese.
Now, one thing before we say anything.
Una cosa antes de hablar, nada.
Before we say anything.
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema.
You must tell me when you are coming to South Africa.
Me tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
1994, Mandela's wish came true. Fidel Castro amongst the guests at the Union buildings, as South Africa ushered in a new democracy. Certainly more profound and controversial, Castro's 1998 address to the National Assembly in Cape Town. This report by Lihana Tsoteti details how one side of the House was in awe and the other, the silence, was loud.
Members of the National Party seemed to show no appreciation. The Democratic Party did not attend the sitting, and the Freedom Front described him as an oppressor of human rights.
The Democratic Party believes it's completely inappropriate for the Democratic Parliament of South Africa to confer this honor on a ruthless dictator.
Despite these remarks, the bilaterals between South Africa and Cuba are unwavering. All ANC presidents since Nelson Mandela have walked the soil of the Caribbean island.
Not only are we Cuban, but part of humanity, and we fight for the honor and well-being of all humankind.
And over the years, bilateral agreements have strengthened, even after Castro handed over the reins to his brother Raul in 2008. Whether it is South African students studying in Cuba or Cuban doctors in South Africa, the relationship stretched wide.
One of the successes of this visit is that we have finalized a 210 million rand credit line package to Cuba.
It is this handshake at the memorial of Nelson Mandela which many believe led to the moment that would lead to the reopening of the US Embassy in Havana.
The reopening of the American Embassy in Havana for the first time in 54 years.
To the man who has reportedly survived more than 600 assassination attempts, the man who led Cuba for nearly 50 years, who remained unshaken despite US economic sanctions. Many in South Africa say, hamburgers.
South African political parties lauded Castro's role in the liberation of African countries on Thursday. The National Assembly was debating a draft resolution by the ANC on the life and times of the late Cuban leader. Deputy Minister of Public Works and SACP member Jeremy Cronin recounted the historical ties that leaders like Nelson Mandela shared with Castro.
By 1945, with the end of the Second World War and the defeat of fascism and Nazism in Europe and militarism in Japan, a bloody first half of the 20th century drew to a close. At a global level, there was now a relative stalemate between the Western imperialist powers under the dominance of the United States and an emerging socialist bloc of countries. The first half of the 20th century had seen two catastrophic world wars, with much of the bloodshed occurring in Europe. But now, in the second half of the 20th century, the epicenter of the struggle for human justice, for democracy, for national self-determination shifted to the geopolitical south. Europe had been liberated, temporarily as it seems, from fascism, racism, and foreign occupation. But throughout the geopolitical south, their close cousins were alive. Various toxic versions of colonialism prevailed. Neo-colonialism, settler colonialism, semi-colonialism as in China, apartheid colonialism here in South Africa. Always accompanied by rabid racism. All of these were the order of the day in the global south. And it was in this context that in the late 1940s and into the 1950s that a new generation of popular, dynamic, and fearless revolutionary leaders emerged. Some were to die relatively young. Che Guevara, Patrice Lumumba, martyrs in struggle. Others survived into the late 20th century. Some of these had, however, lost their revolutionary vigor by this stage. But there were outstanding exceptions. Those who survived into the late 20th century with their authority, their humanism, and their reputation intact and enhanced. And among them were Fidel Castro and Nelson Mandela. Both were born into relatively privileged but poor families in the midst of deep rural poverty and under the scourge of oppressive regimes. In the case of Cuba, the island was a neo-colony of the United States, with supine and corrupt comprador local leaders. Havana was turned into a brothel and casino, the playground of the mafia, while the majority of Cubans were pressed into backbreaking work in US-owned sugar and tobacco plantations. As a young law student in Havana, Fidel moved increasingly in radical left circles. In July 1953, Fidel first came to national prominence within Cuba when he and a small group of fellow radicals launched an armed attack against the Moncada barracks. The attack was defeated, some were killed, and others, including Fidel, were captured. But the event served to galvanize a rising tide of opposition to the corrupt Batista regime. And in particular, it was the young Fidel's rousing speech in his trial from the dock, which was later published as History Will Absolve Me. A year later, Fidel was released. Batista, the despot, made the mistake of underrating Fidel. He was released on amnesty and went into exile. With his brother Raul, he teamed up with other Latin American radicals, including the Argentinian Che Guevara. They formed the July 26th movement and planned an armed liberation struggle back in Cuba. And in November 1956, in a rickety boat called the Granma, 81 armed revolutionaries set sail from the coast of Mexico to Cuba. The trip was planned to last for 5 days, and through their underground contacts back in Cuba, they had planned that there would be diversionary attacks in other parts of Cuba away from the selected landing area. These duly occurred, but the boat itself was so rickety that unfortunately the 5-day trip took 7 days as they were bailing out water and so forth, by which time their own plans had been uncovered and they were ambushed on landing. Once the survivors had regrouped in the Sierra Maestra, it was found that only 19 of the original 81 had survived, and these included Fidel and Che Guevara. And they were to become the core of a liberation struggle in the Sierra Maestra with the support from left-wing parties and trade unions in the towns and cities of the island. And this movement remarkably swept through the island in a very short time, arriving in Havana on the January the 1st, 1959. The dictator, Batista, fled to the United States with his suitcases stuffed with millions of stolen dollars. In February, Fidel was sworn in as Prime Minister of the country, and a series of radical reforms were quickly enacted. A cap on land holding was placed at 402 hectares. Foreign ownership of Cuban land was prohibited. 200,000 peasants within a matter of months received title deeds for their land. A mass literacy campaign was launched with college and university students suspending their studies for a year and going into the countryside to provide literacy to the peasants who had carried the backbone of the struggle against Batista. So they were not protesting for fees to fall, but doing a patriotic duty and devoting a year of their studies to a solidarity effort of development in the deep rural areas. And it was dangerous as well. The counter-revolutionaries attacked them. Some were killed and martyred in the process. Of course, the reaction of Cuba's near neighbor, the United States, just 90 kilometers away, was soon coming. Oil exports from the United States were cut back. When Cuba then was forced to import oil from the Soviet Union, the Shell, Esso, and Standard Oil refineries refused to refine the product. This was in the first few months after the revolution. Fidel's response was typical, and it was decisive. He nationalized the refineries. The US then cut Cuba's sugar export quota, and again the response was patriotic and decisive. The US-owned sugar mills were nationalized along with US banks. But Fidel Castro understood very well that the US would not be content simply to destabilize the Cuban revolution through economic and financial means, especially as these were clearly not working. And with every step to undermine them, the popularity of Fidel and the July 26 movement increased. And so Fidel realized that something worse would be coming soon. He doubled the size of the Cuban army, but more importantly, in September 1960, a people's militia known as the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, was established. These were street and block committees. They were provided with basic military training, but also were responsible for community work, for home-based care visits and other things. They were genuine organs of popular power of the kind that we began to develop in South Africa in the 1980s, in the face of the massive repression that we were facing. By 1970, 1/3 of Cuba's population was involved voluntarily in these CDRs. Block-based, street-based committees, a form of popular democracy quite remote from the Trump versus Clinton so-called democracy that we see, plutocracy that we see in the United States. And this was the decisive factor, this popular support and popular organization in the very survival of the Cuban Revolution, enabling Fidel to outlast 10 US presidents and 637 assassination attempts. In April 1961, the US launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, using Cuban exile proxies trained and armed by the CIA, with a US fleet steaming off the coastline and aircraft bombing Cuban infrastructure. A mass beach landing was undertaken. It was routed within a matter of days, with Fidel himself in the front line, leading at the front. He later said, "What the imperialists cannot forgive us is that we made a socialist revolution under their very noses." On the basis of these advances and the defense of the revolution in the face of a blockade which still continues, notwithstanding some amelioration under Obama, Cuba has made amazing social advances which other speakers have referred to. In literacy, in healthcare, infant mortality in Cuba is far below that of the United States. In technology, today Cuba is a world leader in biotechnology and in much else. Fidel was always a proud patriot. But, like the revolution he led, he was also imbued with a deep sense of internationalism. He once put it, "The imperialists don't understand that our country is not just Cuba. Our country is also humanity." These were not just words. Over the decades, Cuba has selflessly deployed hundreds of thousands of doctors, engineers, soldiers to the Middle East, to Latin America, and indeed here to Africa. And what is especially remarkable about these deployments is that the Cubans have never asked for one single cent. They've never asked for mining concessions or for a slice of the business action in countries that they have literally saved from devastation, in countries, many countries in which thousands of Cubans lost their lives. As Southern Africans, we should honor this, and one's proud to see that the majority of political parties, but not all, are honoring this and do understand this. And we should know this better than most in the world. Soon after Angolan independence, the CIA, working out of Mobutu's Zaire, and the apartheid regime with its bases in occupied Namibia, then called Southwest Africa, planned a joint pincer movement to capture Luanda and defeat the freshly elected MPLA government. In 1975, Savimbi's UNITA, backed by apartheid South Africa, and Roberto Holden's FLNA, backed by the CIA, were literally on the outskirts of Luanda. And it was the dramatic arrival of 18,000 Cuban troops airlifted and shipped in at the 11th hour that literally saved the day. The history of Southern Africa would be quite different if that had not happened. In 1987, an even more decisive battle occurred in southern Angola at Cuita-Cuanavale. In the dry season of that year, Angolan government forces had advanced on Savimbi's Jamba headquarters, but they had overstretched their logistic supply lines, and the apartheid regime had been waiting for just this moment to launch a lightning motorized attack with the aim of definitively cutting off and defeating the Angolan government forces. And this plan nearly succeeded, and it was only frustrated by the technical capacity of the Cuban forces to rapidly build advanced airfields. The Cuban-piloted Soviet MiG jet fighters outmatched the apartheid Mirage fighters, and suddenly the balance of conventional armed capacity had shifted in southern Africa. The apartheid invasion forces no longer had air superiority, and they were forced to beat a hasty retreat back over the Namibian border. In 1988, within a matter of months, the New York Accords were signed, forcing the apartheid forces to leave Namibia, and in 1990, Namibia celebrated its independence. And our own negotiated transition here in South Africa commenced in the same year. As Fidel once said, the history of Southern Africa will be written as before and after Cuita-Cuanavale. But these advances in Southern Africa were to coincide with a dramatic global development, the collapse of the Soviet bloc of countries. Suddenly, after 3 decades under a US-imposed blockade, Cuba found itself deprived of its one lifeline. It couldn't import oil, its own sugar exports collapsed, and by 1992, the economy had declined by 40%. The response of Fidel and the Cuban people was typical. It was not to surrender themselves into the hands of the IMF. It was not to abandon ship. This island of just 11 million people, faced with isolation, embarked on a heroic program of sovereign self-sufficiency. They moved away from the old neo-colonial dependence on monocropping, in their case sugar and tobacco. They moved away from large energy-intensive state and cooperative farms to smaller farms. They even replaced tractors with oxen and found that the latter were better for soil conservation. Deprived of access to extensive industrial fertilizers, they adopted widespread vermiculture. Important advances were made in localized solar energy resources and much else. By 2006, Cuba was the world's only nation which met the UNDP's definition of sustainable development, sustainably putting back into nature what it was taking out. Typically, Fidel internationalized this new direction. Cuba's energy and sustainability challenges, he said, were a forerunner of a global challenge and a global catastrophe facing humanity. As he never tired of arguing in the last decades of his life, if the entire world's population was to consume at the level of the average North American, then we would need 7 planet Earths. Simply not possible. The path of profit-driven, capitalist growth underpinned by imperialist aggression is simply unsustainable. It is, in fact, a crime against nature, and since we are all part of nature, it is a crime against humanity. Long live the memory of Fidel Castro, patriot, internationalist, humanist. Long live.
Thank you very much.
These are live pictures coming to you out of Santiago de Cuba, where Fidel Castro will be laid to rest. Well, it's AM in Cuba right now, of course. The clock is ticking up towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon here in South Africa. We're waiting for the procession to arrive, and we will take those live pictures when they come in. Well, right now I'm joined in studio by Professor John Stremlau, who is a visiting professor of international relations at the University of the Witwatersrand. Now, in our Durban studios, we also have ANC veteran stalwart, former Minister Mac Maharaj. Very good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you for joining us from Durban.
Good afternoon to you.
If I can start here in Johannesburg with you, Professor. I'd like to look at immediately what is next. We read that the brother of Fidel Castro, Raul, will only be in office for another couple of years as well. What does the future look like? It looks a little bit uncertain if you look at the Trump factor that's sort of peeking over the fence at the moment.
It's a very good question, because Barack Obama has been to Cuba in March of this year, and things were opening up in the U.S.-Cuban relations with Hillary Clinton's prospect for being president. With Trump, the bets are off. It may be a time for South Africans to ask themselves what they can do to pay back for all the enormous sacrifice that the Cubans made in the struggle for liberation down here, because I think the Cubans would benefit greatly from contacts with your media, with your civil society organizations, with the vitality that is the South African democracy. Mandela and Castro were good friends, but they had very different ideologies, and I think South Africa could play a very important role in the transition that seems to be looming now in Cuba.
That's very interesting. If I can come to you, Mr. Maharaj, if you can give us your view on what Professor Stremlau was just talking about. But I think sometimes South Africans underestimate the contribution that Cuba and Fidel Castro in particular has made to the South Africa we live in today.
Well, I think that the Cuban contribution to Africa as a whole and South Africa has been phenomenal. It has set a new precedent. Previously, we had foreign troops on our soil who came here to plunder our riches and leave us dead while they went back to enjoy our riches. The Cubans have come to Africa to help us gain our freedom. They have not taken our wealth away. They have in fact returned their soldiers who lost their lives on our soil so that their bodies may be buried in their homeland. So they have been selfless in that regard. And they have taught us a very important lesson about our understanding of freedom, namely that freedom is indivisible, that the world cannot be free if the entire world is not free.
The revolution and the freedom that you're talking about, where is that today?
I think that I would move from the premise of Professor Stremlau. It's not just the relations or the changes will go on in Cuba. The world today is in a state of flux, and there is a retreat taking place across the board in the developed world of retreating into protectionism, whereas the nature of the world economy is to bring us into interrelationships. Cuba took its path under the face of an economic embargo imposed since 1961-62 by the United States. And right now, it is possible that under Trump, that process will be tightened even further. So we face huge challenges. How they are going to be resolved cannot be on the basis of a single country doing it on its own. It will have to be that we have to stand together around the world in order to change the direction of the world economic order.
That said, Professor Stremlau, now we're talking about the facts that are on the table right now. China's global strategy, for instance, what Mr. Maharaj is alluding to. How do we build a multipolar world? Is that possible?
Well, you know, Thabo Mbeki had an approach that I thought was very commendable. It's from the bottom up, but it's people to people working more cooperatively. I think under Donald Trump, all bets are off. No one knows what he'll do. He doesn't probably have a policy. It's very erratic. But it's a reminder, perhaps, that the self-reliance that Cuba has succeeded in doing is also a self-reliance that South Africa prides itself in, but they're very different systems. And I think they could learn at this stage, particularly on the Cuban side, from the South African experience, good and bad. And I think that's the kind of bottom-up, you're going to determine your own future, we're going to determine our own future here, but we have to do it together and yet recognize our differences and a lot more openly. That's what Thabo Mbeki's whole African Renaissance was about in this continent.
You mentioned Donald Trump. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
I certainly would take issue on the self-reliance concept that Professor Stremlau is putting. If it is a country-by-country self-reliance, I think we are on a losing wicket.
I agree.
For example, former President Mbeki's self-reliance was predicated on the unity of the African continent so that its cooperation will build sufficient economic momentum and muscle. And we have to put these things in a relationship. But if we retreat into individual countries thinking that by their own individual self-reliance they would be able to propel this world in new directions, then I think that there are huge question marks that arise on the feasibility of such a proposition.
I agree completely on that point. It's just that I think the idea that you look to always the American or some hegemonic power rather than look to yourselves collectively, as Mbeki was, I think, so impressive in leading South Africa into the region, that has to be rekindled. And I think perhaps what South Africa learned from that mindset, which I agree with Mac Mirage very much on this, might share the Cuban involvement in a more collective but also self-reliant collectively effort.
Mr. Mirage, you talk about that. Talk to us then about the role of BRICS and the role of BRICS, South Africa's involvement, and how you would like to see that play out in the next decade.
I think the story of South Africa post-94 has been, one, a recognition that it cannot detach itself from the world economy, but the second, that it is striving to get a rearrangement in the world economic order and the rules of the game. But the context is changing rapidly. We now have the example of the European Union before us. And whereas 10 years ago it looked like a huge success story, today its success story has a huge question mark around it. So we in Africa are faced with those challenges, and we have been searching for that unity amongst us in the continent-wide. But how to do that is going to be an enormous challenge. There are no ready-made answers to it. I don't know, for example, whether the idea of a single currency is feasible at this stage in Africa. Have we laid sufficient groundwork for that cooperation to reach the point where a single currency is feasible? Have we laid sufficient groundwork where the African Union is able to intervene in the internal affairs of a fellow country, where the continent believes that the direction is inimical to human rights and sustainable development? I don't know the answers to that, but I know that the challenges we face now tell us that the example of the European Union cannot be followed slavishly. Maybe we have to look at it from the point of view of the mistakes it may have committed.
Mr. Mirage, if we can just come back to today's proceedings, I want to talk about the importance that Fidel Castro played, specifically in the late 80s in Angola, the Cubans, the Battle of Quito Cuernaval, what Africa looked like before the battle, and then what followed after that, the changes that came.
Well, I would like in that respect to say that the South African love affair between the people of Cuba and South Africa, between Fidel and Mandela, goes back to the late 50s. It goes back to the attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, which failed, and the trial of Fidel Castro, where he did not deny anything that they did. In fact, he went forward to take pride in standing up for democracy. And the result is that his speech, which ended that history will absolve me, resonated with us because our 156 leaders were on treason trial. And fellow activists like me took enormous courage from that. And that was the beginning of our love affair. The second point, that on the reverse side, South Africa, Portugal, and Rhodesia under Smith had formed an agreement to cooperate with each other to withstand the liberation movements and defeat them, both in the Portuguese colonies, in Rhodesia, and in South Africa. And so from there begins a love affair, which reinforces each other's courage, morale, and strength. And the battle that takes place then, firstly, in defeating the efforts of South Africa CIA-sponsored intrusion into Angola to prevent the MPLA from taking power in 1974-75, which is defeated and the South Africans retreat. It goes on to South African occupation in southern Angolan territories and handing them over to the forces of UNITA, all in the pursuit of an objective to overthrow the MPLA government and install a pro-Western government in Luanda. We then come to the massacres in Kasinga, in which the South African troops were involved, and we begin to see that, in fact, Kuta Kunavala buried the military ambitions of the apartheid regime vis-à-vis Africa. That was an important moment, but it was the culmination of a relationship that grew in defense of Angolan independence and in favor of the liberation movements in Southern Africa as a whole.
I thank you, sir. I just want you to talk to us after Cuito Cuernaval. If you can talk about Chester Crocker and the kind of negotiations that follow out of that brought us independence in Namibia and eventually what happened in South Africa.
Well, that's a very important history, and in fact, it did, as Mac Mirage was saying, set in train a procedure that brought democracy finally to South Africa. I guess I can't resist pointing out in the limited time we have that Mandela is no longer with us, and now another giant, Castro, has passed. Where is the next generation of leadership going to come that would rekindle the Cuban-South African relationship in a way that would be creative to the kind of problems that Mac Mirage was pointing to today? There seems to be a void of leadership in the African continent, and there's no Thabo Mbeki on the scene today. And there seems to be a need for a new generation to come to the fore here, to come to the fore in Cuba, and certainly now to come to the fore in the United States and most other countries as we're seeing the problems afflict Europe. So it's a very creative moment, and it's a moment I hope that South Africa's voice gets to be heard a little bit louder than the rest, because I think your experience here adds great richness to the kind of debates that are going to go on in Cuba.
I'll ask both of you gentlemen to hang around, but we move on a little bit now. Now, Fidel Castro is praised in the developing world for his remarkable achievements in areas of literacy, free education, and of course, healthcare across Cuba. However, in other parts of the globe, he's often criticized for clamping down on the democratic cornerstones of free speech, freedom of association, and other areas of human rights. Now, our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce Pease, reporting from Havana for us, chatted to two locals about the outpouring of grief we are witnessing on the streets of Cuba and what life is like in the country for those actually living there.
Let's talk about free speech.
Yeah. As you know, as it's generally widely known, in Cuba there is only one official press and television and so on. And the unique party system makes sure that the public expressions, the public propaganda, the public message are always in agreement with what that party and the power considers right. So you have to be very careful if you think otherwise. It can get you into trouble in your work.
What sort of trouble? What sort of trouble?
You, at least you can have difficulties to progress, to get higher positions. And you can be even sacked out of your work if you speak too loud.
So you could be fired?
You could be fired.
I think, well, I would just say an example. My boyfriend, has been fired twice from different jobs just because he has different political ideas. And I'm talking about leftist political ideas.
So still socialism, but
Yes, socialism.
but a little different.
A little different with criticism to the system is not allowed. So we are really in a very bad position. In general, the Cuban democracy, is not working as it should be. I think that, we lost the chance to give to the world a model of a real democracy, but we didn't. I think our democracy is different from other countries. It's okay, I'm okay with that, but I would love that. That difference is in a more democracy for the workers,
Right.
for the people who can decide, who can be part of the decisions made by the government. So in terms of human rights, the right to profess a different kind of political perspective, having a different political party, etc. It's important.
I mean, we often talk about the economic embargo, the blockade, the U.S. Blockade in terms of economic terms, and how it's kind of reduced the ability of Cuban society to develop economically. But are these not part of the political consequences of the embargo? The fact that this is a more closed system than most democracies.
I don't think so. I think, of course, the embargo, yes, it has other consequences other than economic consequences. I understand that. But in Cuba it works as an excuse for the government to say, okay, we won't allow this, we won't allow freedom of speech, we won't allow free press because of the embargo. And I really don't see the connection. I think you can fight against the system of the global system, against capitalism, against United States, the imperialism, and at the same time provide for your people all the rights. So I don't see the contradiction.
So at the moment, a few people decide, and the majority don't have a voice.
That's a perception quite accurate, although there always will be people who will say that the mass of the people agree with that little group in the government.
So let me ask you both one more question, because I have to wrap. What do you think the legacy of Fidel Castro is going to be? I'll start with you.
Well, I think I already mentioned that I think that it's a sad thing to say, but I will say it anyway. I think we lost the chance with Fidel Castro to build a radical, different society. I know Cuba is different from other countries. I know all these rights that you mentioned, we agree with those, but at the same time, I feel, and our group, we are leftists, we are socialists, we are anarchists, we feel it's not enough. So we lost the chance to produce that kind of alternative, a new kind of democracy, a new kind of economy for the world. So I think that is what is left, and it's sad to say because now it's not going to happen, definitely. With the reforms of Raúl Castro, we're definitely going into a new country, completely capitalist. That's what is going to happen in Cuba. So, unfortunately, that's what I feel.
So you lost an opportunity, do you agree?
Yeah, I think we lost the opportunity. Now the current reform programs of the government is driving Cuba slowly but steadily to a regular mainstream economy with more capitalist components inside it, and are getting rid of the social welfare elements that were so strong and so important.
Okay, gentlemen, Rogelio Diaz Moreno and Isabel Diaz Torres, they are both members of the Cuban Critical Observatory, a different perspective from the ground here in Havana, Cuba.
Thanks to our reporter there, Sharon Bryce Pierce, chatting to Cubans. But we're still with our guest in studio is Solima Paila from the South African Communist Party, who will be giving us more details on how they view the late Cuban leader, the former president of Cuba, Fidel Castro. Good and welcome to SABC News 24.
Thank you very much.
Yes, as the South African Communist Party, what would you say is the legacy which was left by the late president of Cuba?
Well, Fidel left us a great legacy. He has left us a legacy of solidarity, of internationalism, of patriotism, of humanism, and of a fight against all forms of exploitation, against imperialism, and the capitalist system in which the developed countries of the world have largely been driving their economies through capitalism, which is a system that actually takes out from the workers and empowers a few out of taking from the millions or majority of workers. So he had dedicated himself to fight against that legacy, and he has proved in Cuba that the only alternative system that cares for everybody is a system of socialism. The issue might be how we differ about how to implement socialism, but given the developments in Cuba, for the poorest of the poor having access to education, health, housing, food, which the most developed countries today are not able to match, you can see that he has left us a very great legacy, and I think it's a legacy that we must strive to fight for.
Those things seem to be changing all across the world when it comes to different systems that different countries believe in. Do you believe that there is hope in socialism, considering that some criticize it, saying that economically, when we look at Cuba as an example, it's not at its optimal stage?
No, socialism remains a superior system for human dignity, human development. The only issue with, for instance, I mean, even if you were to compare the level of development of the former Soviet Union, for instance, it was one superior system at the level of human development. They were the first to go onto the space and so forth. Scientifically, for what humanity needs, the socialist system has always proved itself to be the best. But we will always fight for socialism for as long as there's exploitation of the workers by any other country all over the world, by the people in those respective countries, particularly if they continue to use a system of capitalism. So having said that, I think that it's also critical to say Cuba is being compared without taking into account the atrocious economic blockade that lasted over 50 years. It cost that country almost 1.4 trillion rands in value terms, and more than that. So that, imagine if Cuba, at the level of its development, had that capacity to have that kind of resource to use for itself. But the Americans, abusing the position that they have as the leading world economy in the world economy, they then decided to subjugate Cuba, threatened every other person who traded with Cuba, and other people will there, for instance, if you take you send ship with products to Cuba, that ship will not enter American waters for over 6 months. So those kind of penalties, no other country could actually afford to pay. So they decided, therefore, to also avoid Cuba, except very few countries like Spain, Canada, which continue to try and trade with Cuba, but at minimal level. But at strategic level, the economic blockade actually continued to threaten and throttle Cuban development. But despite all that, Cuba has the best human development index than that of the USA and many other developed countries in Europe.
And since 1959, it has been said that the education system as well as the health system in Cuba has improved significantly. How does that help in developing the human capital that you referred to?
Of course, that's very important. For us, we've got technicians and scholars, doctors that were trained in Cuba. For countries of the South, I mean, some of the countries like when they sent thousands of doctors to Panama, the country could not even produce its own currency. It was using cocoa butter shells to produce currency. In the most rural areas, people were dying of basic diseases. Fidel sent doctors, Cuban internationalists in their own right, because these are conscious beings themselves. They volunteer, by the way. It's not a forced program, this of volunteerism in Cuba. The doctors volunteer. That is why even when they went to Liberia as well as Ivory Coast to fight against Ebola, they volunteered to come there. So when they sent them there, they went to eradicate all possible eradicatable diseases in other parts of the world. So they have now been exporting this human capital in other parts of the world, in South Africa as well, and other African countries, in the Middle East, in many Latin American countries. So they've been doing exceedingly well, and I think that having done that, the countries that are awarding huge resources to themselves and are not using them for the development of human beings should actually be ashamed of themselves and actually re-look into that and begin to take humanity first. In fact, the UN should consider the models of Cuba. In fact, they've given them huge accolades, particularly with regard to education and health, but they should also consider many other models that the Cubans have been trying for the development of the world as a whole, not just for the developed countries.
And whilst you say that about the UN, you did say that maybe it's time for South Africa to reprioritize the memory of the late Cuban leader. Can you share more details on that?
Yes, well, actually reflecting that we shouldn't celebrate Fidel in abstract. We should celebrate him also to our conditions, for instance. Fidel was a man that led by example. The Cubans will tell you that if he didn't have something, or if they didn't have something, even Fidel didn't have. Now, can we say the same with us here? Of course, we're in a capitalist country, but we shouldn't justify it on the basis of the capitalist country. The people in leadership of this country are revolutionaries who were in the trenches, who were in jail, who were in exile, and so forth. So what we were saying was that we need also to reprioritize how we spend our resources, how we focus on the poorest of the poor, how we discipline capital, for instance, that has huge resources but is unable to spend these resources. For instance, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange has over 500 billion rands in liquid value, that is in liquid cash that can be deployed in different areas for investment when the country is in a crisis, economic crisis of some sort, where we have the highest level of unemployment ever, huge inequalities that are deepening and so forth. And they have left all of these things into the hands of the state. I can tell you this will not take place in Cuba. Fidel would have disciplined capital, would have reprioritized development. Both capital and the state and the workers would have come together to map the way forward, and capital will be forced to commit resources, or else the resources will be taken for the people. Because largely those resources are resources of the people. The products that we see are products that the people produce. So the development, therefore, should be focused on the needs of the people than on the needs of few individuals who are rich.
And given those sentiments, would you say that the SACP is on that route, given the criticism that people have on SACP leaders saying that SACP is not what it still was? Would you say that Fidel will be proud of what SACP is today?
No, Fidel has always been proud of the Communist Party and Communist parties all over the world, including our Communist Party. Before Crisani died, he had a 6-hour meeting with Fidel in his last meeting trip that he took on behalf of the Communist Party with a delegation with Fidel one-on-one. When we were in Cuba in December, we had a long meeting with President Raul Castro, with General Secretary Bladin Zimande. They still value the contribution of the Communist Party in South Africa. We have very strong relations, strong bond. As per our values, our criticisms are largely not from, not from outside, but from the capitalists here, who are afraid that we are confronting them. And even some of our own comrades who have become capitalists, who are now afraid that actually we don't want them to enjoy the so-called fruits of freedom. That is why when we fight to defend state-owned enterprises from parasitic bourgeoisie, or what the ANC calls bureaucratic bourgeoisie, whether it's the Guptas or any other such groupings, BEE elements and so forth, who just want to take tenders, state tenders, don't do the work properly and enrich themselves, then they come for us, but they don't rectify the mistake that they're doing. So that is why we've raised this question that we must deal with capital in its broadest form, whether it's a small-scale capital at the level of the Guptas, or real monopoly capital at the level of the Oppenheimers and others, the Ruperts and so forth. We have to confront capital. Otherwise, this country will never be able to develop to the extent that it seeks. And when we say that as the SACP, they start attacking us. For instance, I was posed a question on Monday by one of the journalists who said, yeah, but you communist, even what dresses do you wear? So it's as if when you are a communist, you should not even have any dress. The point is, we say as communists, we deserve everything that everybody deserves. We are fighting against the inequalities in the allocation of resources, the inequalities in access to basic services for humanity. So we want all of us to have same rights, same availability of resources.
Thank you. We'll take it further as we continue with the program. That's Solima Paila from SACP, who will continue to be with us throughout the program. The United Nations would like to see the era of openness between the U.S. and Cuba continue. That's the word from the spokesperson of the Secretary General, after concerns in some quarters that the new era of engagement under the administration of President Barack Obama will be rolled under Donald Trump. Senior Trump officials have in recent days indicated that the president-elect might undermine some of the Obama achievements if Cuba did not make greater concessions in the human area and media freedom.
As Cubans mourn the late Comandante, a firm message from Trump officials that efforts to normalize relations between the two countries are in real jeopardy.
He's been very clear that the major priority now is to make sure Cubans on Cuba have the same freedoms that Cubans here in America have, which is political, religious, and economic freedom. Make sure those political prisoners are finally released into freedom, and make sure the American fugitives face the law.
But at the United Nations, a month after the General Assembly voted 191-0 for the U.S. economic embargo on Cuba to be lifted, including an abstention from the United States for the first time in history, there is still concern that this era of rapprochement will fade. After all, the vast majority of UN member states have been calling for the embargo to be lifted for a quarter of a century. This tweet from the president-elect earlier Monday, that without a better deal for the Cuban people, he would terminate efforts put in place by President Obama.
The agreements that we've seen in recent years, and very recently, between the U.S. and Cuba on the rapprochement, on the increased trade, and the openness of the relationship was welcomed by the UN. We continue to welcome it. I think it is a critical relationship in the Western Hemisphere. The rapprochement is clearly a positive move in the sense of clearing up what had been, to say the least, a very complicated relationship between U.S. and Cuba.
The UN Chief's office also indicating that he will not be travelling to Cuba for planned memorials and a state funeral on December 4th. Shervin Bricebeest, SABC News, New York.
Well, you're watching a special broadcast. We're broadcasting the funeral procession today of El Comandante, Fidel Castro. Will be laid to rest shortly. With me still in studio, I've got Professor John Stremler with me, and then in Durban we've got Mr. Mac Maharaj. If I can escalate the conversation, because we heard what Mr. Mapiila had to say a little bit earlier, can I ask you, in today's world, we live in a capitalist state where the banks are bailed out by the state. What do you call that?
Well, you might call it state capture, but it is the case that the lines between the governments and the capitalist system have been blurred, but things are changing. I just have to remind you, Cuba doesn't have quite the options that some of the bigger countries have. It's only got 11 million people. So how it fits in to this changing global system is a real puzzle. And I think there again, it's going to take some time for them to sort it out, and they need partners like South Africa to help them.
Mr. Maharaj, capitalism with banks being bailed out left, right and center, is that the new normal?
Certainly it's not a sustainable situation. The development is pointing to the limits of capitalist development. But I must say that the other side of the coin of what is the future needs to be looked at very carefully. So far, the experiments in building socialism in various countries, including the Soviet Union, have failed. And so we need to be very, very cautious in where we go. I think that the issue around Cuba and Fidel Castro is that over time he will be remembered, one, as a freedom fighter, two, who stood for social justice and equality. And the precise path to that is something that we are still fashioning, hewing out of rock. So that's a challenge that's going on. It is clear the criticisms that we have of capitalism. But what is not sufficiently clear is what replaces it and how it replaces it. Some people tend to see the development as a sharp break. I think history at the moment delivers us different lessons, and it tells us that the search for equality, social justice, is something that cannot be divorced from also the issue of freedom and democracy. It is a bit concerning that Fidel is seen by his enemies as a dictator and by his friends as a freedom fighter. Now, clearly, the same set of facts in this modern world are leading us to two opposite conclusions. And it must tell us that putting issues into these separate boxes is incorrect. There is an intimate relationship between democracy and empowerment of the people, as well as the issues of social and economic development and the issue of social justice and equality. So these are interrelated problems, and what the criticism and the weaknesses of the system is showing us is that A, the system of capitalist development has reached its limits, is unsustainable, that the new world order that is there can only come about through searching and concrete experiences and learning from mistakes we made in the construction and continue to make in the construction of the new order.
Prof?
Well, it may be a laboratory to see whether the egalitarianism, which is so admirable in Cuba, can be sustained in the kind of world that McMurage is referring to, because don't forget, Castro did have a threat, the United States. He also had a patron, the Soviet Union. And that kind of subsidy now is only being picked up through trade and through remittances. $1 billion a year come from Cubans in America to Cuba. He's going to have to, or his successors will have to innovate the kind of democratic dispensation that may be more fair and equitable, as McMurage and I would like to see, but that will come at certain prices. And so how Cuba manages this course is very important, just not for Cubans, but for the region and for the world. When Castro came to power, the region was full of right-wing dictators. Now today, the region is a very mixed picture of democracies like Africa is today. Cuba is going to have to modernize, whatever that term means, in their preferences, but the process is going to have to watch very carefully, and I think maybe we can learn something from that.
Mr. Maharaj, is democracy working around the world?
I think democracy as it exists has been an advance in giving people the opportunity to have some say over their destiny. But I think that what is happening around the world, including the Western world, is showing some of the major weaknesses. And that is that people are feeling marginalized, they are feeling irrelevant. And therefore, we have to question whether the formal aspects of democracy that we have created need to be deepened by creating a more participatory system. Now, that's not a question of jettisoning what we have achieved. It's a question of taking what we have achieved and panel beating it and modifying it so that there is a greater active participation of people and that we address the question of that feeling of marginalization. That's a lesson not only that we see in the United States, Britain, and Europe. We see it also in the Arab Spring, that with the social media, there was a power to stop things from happening, but there hasn't been sufficient power to create a new system. And there has been a retreat. So all around the world, there is a growing sense of disempowerment, of marginalization, of a feeling by people that they are irrelevant. And we have to address this question by taking the democracy as it exists and asking what needs to be done to it to ensure that it is more participatory.
You talked about the Arab Spring there, sir, and I think it talks to leadership, what comes next. But I want to ask the Prof here to follow up on you, on what you've just spoken to us about with democracy and capitalism. The two are often seen to go hand in hand, but do they work together, or do we get to an ultimate state where they become incompatible?
Well, they won't become incompatible if the primacy of the rule of law prevails. If you have a judicial system and a constitutional framework which is sufficiently resilient to sustain the experimentation that is capitalism and that is democracy, but that it stays within bounds so that that process becomes increasingly inclusive. It's got to be increasingly inclusive. Now, what we've had in Cuba is a very inclusive system. There was a racist hierarchy that was terrible under Batista, and that was immediately re-engineered by Castro when he came to power. Making sure that, again, that's just a small country of a little island country of 11 million people, making sure that inclusivity becomes part and parcel of the rule of law management and constitution-based governance is the great challenge that South Africa faces, that countries all over Africa that are aspiring to democracy face, and all over Latin America. And I think maybe looking to those experiments may teach us more than looking to the failing experiment right now of the United States, if I can venture a comment.
I want to come back to you, Mr. Maharaj. I see you having a giggle there, and I want to bring it back to Fidel Castro, actually, because we're digressing a little bit off the point. But the father of Namibian independence, the man who ended colonialism per se on the African continent, these things have never been acknowledged. Do you acknowledge Fidel Castro as that leader?
I think to describe him as the father is taking it a bit too far. I think that Fidel himself would be unhappy with that description. I think at the heart of Fidel's drive, if we are to extrapolate and draw from it the positive lessons, is his commitment to the empowerment of people, to creating a socio-economic order in which people are able to control their destiny, in which equality is real. So he has contributed significantly, and as I said earlier, he has reinforced the message that Cubans came to Africa to defend and promote our freedom. They did not come here to plunder our resources for their own benefit. They came here so that their blood is now seeped into the soil of the African continent, and Cuba's future and our future is inextricable. We therefore come to a perception that says that in this situation, with his passing away, with the changes that are happening in the world and will happen in Cuba, Cuba needs us as much as we need Cuba. That friendship was born in the trenches, and the trenches remain that of building a society that is democratic, based on social justice, and realizes equality. So Cuba has been an enormous friend, a champion of freedom, and despite what the detractors say, his memory will live on as a freedom fighter in Africa, and Latin America, if I may say so, and Asia.
I'd just like to add that Castro showed his greatness when once Quito Cunavala was over and there was a possibility of a negotiated transition to independence. The Cubans immediately went along with the London process that brought the South Africans, the Americans, and the stakeholders here together to get a formula. Maybe the model that we should be thinking more about is the Mandela relationship with Fidel Castro, one of mutual respect, one of very real differences politically that Mac Mirage has alluded to, but able to work together for collective benefit.
Absolutely. You're watching a special broadcast here on SABC News. Of course, we're waiting. It's 7:36 a.m. now in Santiago de Cuba, where the late Cuban leader will be laid to rest today. Of course, during his visit to Soweto, in South Africa in 1998, Fidel Castro blamed capitalism for many of the world's problems, including environmental pollution and poverty. He urged South Africans to stand together with Cubans in this battle for a better future. Castro also paid tribute to the sacrifices made by the youth of South Africa in contributing to the country's freedom.
La victoria no se alcanza solamente con las armas.
Victory cannot only be attained with weapons.
Muchas veces incluso se alcanza sin armas.
Quite often, victory can be attained even without weapons.
Y yo no soy un practicante de la filosofía de Mahatma Gandhi.
And I am not a person who practices the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi.
Pero la historia,
but you know what?
La historia
History
ha demostrado
History has proven
que muchas y grandes batallas
that many and great battles
se han ganado
have been won
fundamentalmente con las
basically
ideas.
with ideas.
Por eso siempre digo que lo primero
That's why I always say
es la idea.
that first and foremost come the ideas,
Segundo, luchar
and then
por las
secondly,
ideas.
to fight for those ideas,
Y lo tercero es
and thirdly,
vencer
to win
con el sudor y la sangre, si es necesario,
on the sweat and blood if necessary,
por esas ideas.
for such ideas.
Pienso en esto cuando llego aquí
When I arrive here, I begin thinking about this.
y cuando llego a Sudáfrica
And when I arrive in South Africa,
y cuando visito ese
and when I visited
modesto monumento
that modest memorial
en memoria de aquellos que merecerían
built for those
el monumento
who would deserve
o un monumento con la altura
a monument
del pico Everest,
as high as the Everest
del que se
peak,
dice que es el más alto.
which is said to be the highest on earth.
Ese niño
That child
merece una Himalaya.
would deserve a Himalaya
Ese niño
of
y
a
los
monument.
niños que
That
lucharon
child and the other
y murieron.
and the other children who died
¿Quién era ese niño?
striving would deserve a Himalayas for a
¿Qué
monument.
edad tenía?
How old were those children who died?
¿Por qué lo matan?
Why were they killed?
¿Qué crimen cometió?
What kind of a crime could
Para
that
que
child
ese
have
niño
committed to
fuera
deserve being
asesinado?
killed?
¿Qué idea defendía?
What idea was that child
Es
defending?
que más que una idea, defendía un sentimiento.
More than an idea, that child was defending a
Ese
sentiment.
sentimiento con el que nacemos todos.
That sentiment with which we are all
Todos,
born,
sin
all of us,
excepción.
without exception, are born with that sentiment,
Es el sentido
which is
de la dignidad
the
humana.
sense of human dignity.
Un Soweto.
The world will remember that there was one Soweto,
Y hubo jóvenes
and that
como
there were
aquellos
youth like those
que se sacrificaron
who sacrificed their
por la
lives
dignidad de todos los
for the
seres
dignity
humanos.
of all mankind.
Aquí
Here today,
pudiera decirse con razón
it could be said, and rightly
que
so,
está la cuna,
that here is the cradle,
fue la cuna
because it was the source
de la liberación de Sudáfrica.
of the liberation of South Africa.
Pero un día será como la cuna
And one day it will be considered so.
de la
It will
dignidad
be considered the cradle,
de toda el
the
África.
source of the dignity in the whole of Africa.
Yeah, that was in 1998. Interesting to see Kgalema Motlanthe, much younger Kgalema Motlanthe, in the background there, watching over Fidel Castro's shoulder. But I've still got the Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Solly Mapaia, with me here today. Solly, when you look back at the visit and Fidel Castro, in your sort of personal capacity, what goes through your head now that you're witnessing this event?
Yeah, it was amazing. I was there in Soweto. We went to listen to him speak, and in fact, he spoke without any notes. An amazing speech where he spoke a huge political economy, technology, science, everything else. So it was a great speech, and I think that what happened at that time when he came here, he really re-inspired us as young people about the possibility of our young democracy and what it can achieve. And I think over the years, he will go on and strengthen our relationship between Cuba and South Africa now as government, as well as people to people. We now have more Cubans and more South Africans visiting Cuba, and vice versa. We're exchanging more at the level of professionals, technicians, and all of that. So there's been some lot of good improvement. But to the extent of what is happening now, of course, we are quite saddened that ultimately he has passed on, but he has left a very important legacy for all of us and for the people of the world, the poor. He has always affirmed their dignity and respect for all human beings. And it is that which I think all our government can try and emulate and try to achieve.
Talk about that. It's a very difficult thing, though, to try and emulate, because Fidel was a guy who really pushed for education, for educating his people. And it was almost a project that he oversaw himself. I read the implementation stats of, it was in the space of a decade, they turned the entire education of a nation around. That for us would be very difficult. What do you think would be the kind of lessons or the things that we in South Africa right now, with the kind of crisis we have in education, what are the lessons that we should take from that and push forward?
Well, Fidel, you must also understand that he took power through by military means. There was no negotiations.
Yeah.
He removed the dictatorship, and then the government, his government, was then able to do anything that they had conceptualized the revolution should do. And that's why, for instance, they managed to do and transfer land within 5 months of their coming into office to the peasants, who later on will defend this land when the Americans were invading them. They suspended, for instance, a schooling program in order to go and teach every single Cuban how to read and write, and to teach them numeracy. And that's when they launched the campaign, Each One, Teach One, which we have embraced here in the liberation movement. It's a slogan, it's a very slogan of COSAS. So there are those kind of differences. But of course, to the extent that we need to put our priorities right, education should be a major priority for this country. In fact, it's a priority of government.
It is.
But that priority must be complemented even by resources that we send to education, from primary level right up to university level, health, housing, and so forth. So he prioritized all of those things. He achieved all of those things. So he achieved the basic demands of human requirements. Others are issues of valor and so forth, which are beyond what the revolution can do, but the basics have been achieved. And I think that if our government and the government world over can actually aim to achieve those, I think we'll see much more improvement. And
you're saying it's difficult to achieve this kind of radical change that Fidel has through the traditional freedoms or democratic processes that we know, because these processes can often be cumbersome and averse to change.
It's not difficult. You remember that when President Mandela, in his first 100 days, he declared that all pregnant women will have access to free health. We have not yet rolled out the free program for health, for instance, at that time. So we can do that. For instance, there's too much looting of resources in state-owned enterprises, in government municipalities and other places. We need to be hard on corruption so that we save money for education. We need to be hard on wastage, which the Cubans have been. We need to be hard on the other economic role players, for instance, who increases food prices. So you do something else, they increase food prices, so they devalue your capacity for interventions, say, for instance, for food prices. So if you are dealing, we're stronger on all those kind of interventions and not become too driven by all this system that we can't change. We need to change the system that is currently in existence. That system is taking too long to respond to the people on the ground, the poorest of the poor, who are supposed to be the real beneficiaries of our revolution. The revolution is on course, it's moving ahead. That is why we're being able to build 4 million houses, which the Cubans, by the way, have commended us and said even themselves could not build 4 million houses. But they've managed to resolve the problem of housing. They are still trying to resolve that particular problem. We haven't really reached that particular capacity. So we can't work on conventional methods and think that we can really drive a thoroughgoing revolution in that form.
Solia, thank you for joining us today. Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Mr. Solly Mapahiya, joining us in studio today to talk about El Comandante who will be laid to rest in Santiago de Cuba a little bit later today. This afternoon, early evening South African time, of course it is, quite early in the morning, shortly before 8 a.m. in Cuba right now. But we're now going to look back at some of the highlights that happened in the National Assembly debate a little bit earlier this week, or Thursday to be exact, on a draft resolution by the ANC on the life and times of Fidel Castro.
So we stand as the EFF to support and speak much more positively about El Comandante Fidel Castro. There are those who are giving a different narrative. The right-wingers will, of course, speak like that because they miss the colonial past. But we can talk today that Cuba's unemployment officially stands at less than 3%. And more than 99% of Cubans are literate, meaning that they are able to read and write. Life expectancy is close to 8 years for all the Cuban people. Infant mortality is less than 15 people per 1,000 deaths in Cuba. The health system is the most efficient, is the most responsive in Cuba. It trains thousands of doctors, not only for the people of Cuba only, but for the entire world. There's 23 medical schools in Cuba, and there's a ratio of 1 doctor per 155 people. A dream that is mostly associated with the so-called developed nations. Cuba has got a GDP ratio which is far much lesser in terms of per capita as compared to many countries that have got such developmental indicators. But Cuba is the most developed nation in terms of the impact on human life. And because that is a socialist victory and a socialist achievement, that is what we want to be in South Africa. We want to be like Cuba and South Africa. We unashamedly want to pursue a progressive socialist agenda that will bring about free education for all.
It goes without saying that Fidel Castro Ruz is a continental hero in Africa, and today's condolence motion befittingly sets a precedent for this House in that this is the first time a condolence motion for a political leader outside of South Africa has been debated. But now that the floodgates have been opened, we are sure there will be many more such motions to follow. Fidel Castro stands against political and economic dominance by the West, against all adversity, is in itself worthy of respect and admiration, irrespective of whether one agrees with his political views or not. Governing the Republic of Cuba as he did for 47 years is testament to this icon of communism. Whether this political ideology advanced or regressed the socio-economic standards of the Cuban people is a subject for another debate and not a condolence motion. Under Castro's leadership, Cuba's support for African independence movements was almost unparalleled. Today, South Africa and Cuba share a strong relationship forged in our own struggle for independence.
Honorable members, this is the man who defied the imperialist agenda to the last day of his life. We know very well that as we mourn the passing of this giant, the capitalists and imperialists are celebrating because they attempted more than 600 times to assassinate him, but dismally failed. The former president of USA, George Bush, has been quoted to have referred to Castro as, and I quote, the tyrant who left the earth last week, unquote.
Thank you
Other
very
members
much,
do not care whatever names the imperialists can say to the late commander, but he will always be in the hearts of African children. We'll always salute him. I thank you.
Yes, that was a live package from Parliament earlier on. I'm now joined in studio by Drs. Mabutu Mapopa as well as Dr. Tony Mokangwe, who studied in Cuba. They'll be sharing with us their experiences. Good day and welcome to SABC News 24. Yes, if I can start with you, how was your experience in Cuba and what are impressions of their late leader, Fidel Castro?
Well, my deepest condolences to El Comandante. I was actually shocked when he passed away, and it was something that actually I couldn't expect it happening at this time of the year, especially that we are nearing to an end of the year at the 90 years of age. So my stay in Cuba was a very impressive one, quite a good experience, I must say. I was exposed to a world where things were done differently, where you could actually, when you could feel the humanism as it is. Because when I arrived in Cuba, I had so many questions that I asked myself that I wanted to. One of the questions was why Cuba is doing well in medicine in the world. And then another question was, how did it survive this U.S. and Cuba relation that is very, that is bad actually from the beginning of the revolution. So all those questions were asked when I found out the education system and health system was, doing well, and how Cubans received us and welcoming us in their own home state.
Mm-hmm. And you, Tony, what would you say you've gained from your experience in Cuba?
Well, first and foremost, going to Cuba as a young man from a disadvantaged background, I think that, Cuba first and foremost gave me an opportunity that at first I don't think I had appreciated it much as I do today, because looking back, I see the differences that it's actually, and the impact it's actually had on my life. And I think, just getting to Cuba and being able to experience the patriotism and the humility of the people, I think that gave me an opportunity to look back at myself and look back at our country and to see actually what is it that is the reason that we're brought to Cuba in order for us to come back home and to make that change. And I think, over the years, that has given us an idea to really inculcate this spirit of humanity and of patriotism, and to find sort of solutions and looking into the future on exactly what is it that we can try and do for our communities as a country and as professionals that studied in Cuba.
Mabutu, how do you feel that you being qualified now as a doctor is going to help advance the health in the community?
Well, the challenge that actually we have is the two different systems that we have. The Cuban one, which is primarily preventive medicine, and you get to a country where they deal with curative medicine. So we being incorporated into a system where you really deal with emergencies, and we come from the world where we need to prevent, like a prevention is better than cure principle. So the challenge we have now is how do we take these two systems, or rather use the Cuban system and into our own country, in our own context, which is still a policy that the Minister of Health is still working on, especially in NHI stuff. But now, if you look at the whole world, what it's doing, especially WHO, they acknowledge the universal health coverage, to say you need to cover everyone irrespective of their economic background. So that's what Cuba does. You basically have the free healthcare from the primary until tertiary. So we do find that challenge, because now in the country we still have a shortage of doctors, and in Cuba is not the case. But now what we want to do is just to try and push that agenda that we're trained with and help our communities. The little bit that we can do, and we'll go a long way in helping our communities.
All right. Thank you so much to both of you and for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, much.
Let's listen to Castro's views about capitalism as he was addressing South African Parliament during his state visit. Yes, there is a challenge with our technical, with technicalities here in the studio, but you will pardon us. When we come back, we'll be bringing you the 3 o'clock news bulletin.
Resumed U.S. drone strike in the south of the country has killed 3 al-Qaeda suspects.
Death toll in Yemen's 18-month-old civil war now stands at about 10,000.
people get killed or die and are actually buried before they're recorded. And we don't have a way of recording that, but we know the numbers are much higher.
Water restrictions are to be imposed on villages in and around the Nkomazi municipality.
Pumps can't pump the water because there's no water in a river. And if the water is coming back, then it's full of mud.
Those who can pray and those who can do any miracle to make sure that we've got enough rain, give it a try.
Moved to ease tensions created by the heated public spat between National Treasury and ESCOM.
ESCOM denied allegations of impropriety regarding the matter. National Treasury issued a statement accusing ESCOM of lying.
The fracas over hairstyles at a Pretoria school has drawn sharp focus on underlying racism and alleged abuse in some schools.
We want relevant answers from the MEC. You must fire the principal.
Here too, similar sentiments of underlying racism.
It just made me feel like I was not worthy enough of an education because of the type of hairstyle that I had. Because yesterday the statement was, writing an exam is a privilege.
I don't know if I'm going to succeed, but I want you to tell us, who are these 3 people that you have opened corruption charges against at the Brooklyn police station? How senior are they?
Very.
Are these people who are serving in the political office of the executive mayor?
Yes.
Which means they are no longer working for the city now.
Well, I can tell you that one of them is actually finding themselves employed in another municipality.
You are not going to tell us the names?
No, you're not going to get names from me.
Are people still getting free Wi-Fi in Tshwane?
People are still getting free Wi-Fi, and we will actually make it one of the basic services that our residents will get.
It's now 1500 hours Central African time. A very good afternoon and a warm welcome. This is PM News live across Africa right here on SABC News Channel 404. My name is Aubrey Umpofu in Johannesburg, and joining me this afternoon from the sports desk, Simpiwe Ngongwane. Simpiwe, good afternoon.
My good man, how are you doing?
Fine, thanks, man.
Great
I
stuff.
see the Super Falcons of Nigeria have done it yet again.
Yes. For the 8th time, they retained the trophy they won in Namibia 2 years ago, and I must say that we must say hats off to Banyana. They tried their utmost best.
Sure.
Well, that's coming up a little later, and we'll also take a look at 2 upset premiership matches playing currently, and we have Bloemfontein Celtic hosting SuperSport United, as well as Baroka FC meeting with Maritzburg United. All that and more coming up in a jiffy.
Well, there you have it. So much soccer and more sports stories to look forward to when Simpiwe comes back a little later on. But right now, let's also take a look at the other stories also coming up in the next 60 minutes. Thousands gather in Cuba's second city of Santiago to bid a final farewell to former President Fidel Castro, who passed away 9 days ago. President Jacob Zuma urges the church to help the government build a stable country. He was addressing members of the 12 Apostles Church in Durban. And ahead in your sports news with Simpiwe, Nigeria Super Falcons claim the Women's Africa Cup of Nations for a record 8th time. Thousands of people have gathered in Cuba's second city of Santiago to bid a final farewell to former President Fidel Castro, who passed away on November 25th. A private funeral service will be held for Castro, after which his remains will be interred at a cemetery where other Cuban icons are buried.
The stage is set for the much-anticipated mass rally tonight in Santiago.
the hometown of El Comandante Fidel Castro. A cortege carrying his remains traveled on a 4-day journey across Cuba. Locals lined the streets to bid farewell to their revolutionary leader. Hundreds of dignitaries are expected to attend the mass rally. Amongst them, a strong African delegation, including AU chairperson Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma and the SACP General Secretary Bladen Nzimande.
In fact, were it not for the Cubans sending just over 20,000 troops, Angola and Southern Africa would have been very, very different today. And it was the defeat of the apartheid's army at Cutuquane Valley that laid the basis for Namibian independence in 1990 and the beginning of negotiations at home.
For young people, both Cuban and South African, they will forever cherish his memories.
I'm crying. It's you know, I'm in sorrow. But at the same time, I feel great for that thing happened when I'm here in Cuba and I get to experience everything what was going on and to get more information about his life and how he liberated Cuba and so forth.
Our parents and our grandparents try to teach us every single day more and more about those times and the difficulties they were having.
The death of Fidel Castro marks the end of an era. Fidel Castro may be gone, but his legacy will surely live on. Many remain inspired by his commitment to social justice and equality around the world. Mzondi Lembeje, SABC News, Havana, Cuba.
The African Union Commission chair believes that those that are critical of late Cuban leader Fidel Castro probably do not welcome the progress Cubans have made under his leadership. Speaking exclusively to SABC News in Havana ahead of the internment of the former president's ashes in Santiago today, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma